even remember this in our memory now. It's been going downhill just because of like the advent of like books and technology and everything and life in general becoming simpler. But on
the other hand, there's more learning now because of it. There's more learning online because of it. Anyway, okay, so as we've done in the past here, when we learned the Gemara that was related to halacha, we then learned the corresponding chapter in the Code of Jewish Law, specifically from the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad, who wrote a code. And that's what we're going to do now in terms of the laws of the confessional prayer, which we learned yesterday from the Gemara, is primarily on the eve of Yom Kippur. Now, we touched a little bit on something which is a full-on dispute as to what the Gemara means, and we're going to see how that dispute plays out in law, in halacha. The question is as follows. Make sure I get this right. The Gemara said yesterday, we learned yesterday, that primarily a person forgiveness is to be asked, or confession is to be said on the eve of Yom Kippur. And then we said, because we're worried about you getting distracted by a meal, you do it before Mincha. But nonetheless, you should still do it in the evening. And we noted yesterday the change in language. First it said on the eve of Yom Kippur, and then it said in the evening as if evening prayers. So the question becomes, when the Gemara said that the primary confession is in the eve of Yom Kippur, does that mean before Yom Kippur starts? As we learned yesterday, which give us a total of 7 confessions plus 3 during the repetition? Or does the eve of Yom Kippur actually mean the evening service? In which case a total of 6 confessions plus 3 during repetition. 2 different interpretations of what the Gemara means when it says that the primary confession is on the eve of Yom Kippur. Does it mean before Yom Kippur starts or after Yom Kippur starts in the evening prayer? And that's going to become crystallized as we learn the halacha here. Then the halacha is also going to go on to many other customs that are around the confessional prayer, some of which we addressed a bit in the Gemara, some of which have emerged in the post-Talmudic era. So it's important to know for full context, but it's not directly related to the Gemara we learned in terms of being derived from there as is the primary halacha itself. Okay, so section or chapter 607, the order of the confessional prayer in the mincha, in the afternoon before Yom Kippur. And we have 16 paragraphs or subsections in this chapter. Aleph, section 1. So you can follow, I'm going to read in the Hebrew, but you can follow along in the English. Considering that Yom Kippur is a day of forgiveness and atonement, as the verse says, on this very day, God shall atone for you. Therefore, a person must confess his sins of the year. Because this is the order of what we find by every single offering that is brought in the temple for atonement, that it's accompanied with confession. It's an interesting deduction that the Alter Rebbe gives here. The source is not in the Shulchan Aruch, but rather so the source is not in the Gemara, actually not in our Gemara, at least this source for this deduction. There I found it. It's in footnote Beis in the Hebrew. It's in Lavush. Okay, so we find that all karbanos, any offering in the temple that's meant for atonement, that there has to be a confession of the individual offering the karban. Shenem, as the verse reads, and they shall confess the sins that they have done. So likewise, Yom Kippur as a day of atonement, just like an offering of atonement, requires confession on the part of the one being atoned. And therefore there has to be has to be a confession on Yom Kippur. Now, mitzvahs vidim in Torah, the mitzvah of confession, as it applies to offerings, is at the beginning of atonement, right? That's what they used to do. They used to they would confess before the offering was offered, right? They would put their hands in the thing, on the animal. Isn't that right? Before the offering was offered is when they would confess, right? They put their hands on the animal and confess. So likewise, same thing is true in Kippur. And therefore the vidui should be done at the beginning of when the atonement is beginning to be offered, which is the beginning of the day. This is at the night of Yom Kippur, the beginning of Yom Kippur, because the whole day is like that one big korban. And if the confession has to be at the beginning of the korban / beginning of the day, then the confession is to be at the beginning of the day at the night of Yom Kippur. This is the logic behind the Gemara that we learned yesterday. The Alter Rebbe was presenting it at least. That's a custom that evolved later, but yes, for a similar reason. As we're going to see actually other customs that he mentions here in that regard. Okay. Ella, but our sages were worried, perhaps some occurrence of intoxication, like might happen, might happen at the meal that he has just before Yom Kippur starts. And therefore, he will not be able to properly confess at the beginning of the time of the atonement, which means at the beginning of the day, at the beginning of the 24 hours of Yom Kippur, he would not be able to do it because he's just had his meal and he's a bit carried away, he's a bit drunk. Therefore, they have established that each person should confess on Erev Yom Kippur at the afternoon prayer before he eats his final meal. Nonetheless, right, this is all from the Gemara so far, right? The Gemara said that their initial thing is at the beginning of Yom Kippur. Because there's an issue of a meal, you might get distracted. Say your confession at Mincha before your meal. Even though one confesses at the afternoon prayer, this is the Gemara also said this yesterday, but here's where we get to the dispute. Even though he confessed at Mincha time, he should go back and confess at Ma'ariv, at the evening prayer, implying that the initial confession that the sages said to do at the beginning of Yom Kippur is not talking about, as we learned yesterday, before Yom Kippur starts, before Kol Nidre. It's actually talking about during the evening service. The first opportunity at Yom Kippur, you say confession. The first opportunity is at your first service, at the evening service, during Ma'ariv. But because we're worried about your meal, do it before the meal. So at this point, it would come out that we're doing it at Mincha and at Ma'ariv, and then Shachris, Mosef, etc. Before Kol Nidre, it's not there in this reading of the Gemara, as we'll see in a moment, another reading. And even though he confessed at the evening service, as the Gemara told us yesterday, he goes again and confesses in the morning, perhaps between last night's confession at Ma'ariv and this morning, the morning service, Shachris, some sin happened. And for this very same reason, he should again confess at Musaf, perhaps between Shachris and Musaf he did a sin, and likewise by Mincha in the afternoon prayer of Yom Kippur afternoon, the next day, because perhaps he sinned between Musaf and Mincha, and likewise in Elah, likewise at the fifth prayer, the last prayer of the day, just before Yom Kippur is over, also do confession, because perhaps he sinned between Mincha and Ma'ariv, between Mincha and Elah. Perhaps there's some sort of sin that dragged out through the whole day. Because the entire 24 hours is a full 24 hours of confession, of atonement. And therefore, ideally, it should be done at the beginning, because that's when all confession needs to be done, before the atonement. But because the atonement lasts 24 hours, anytime during the day, you can do the confession. And therefore, do it at the beginning. That's when you're supposed to. But then keep on doing it at every opportunity, because perhaps you sinned some other time in between.
So does that mean it's a good time to stay?
Sorry?
So if you're in the middle of the atonement, does that mean it's a good time to sin? Does that mean get to
Yeah, I don't know. The joke they used to say when we were as kids, we kind of laugh at we used to like joke at the arrogance of the person who thinks he doesn't have any sins. Mm-hmm. Where he says to himself, "Oi, Yom Kippur's coming. I have no sins to confess. Okay, let me go quickly do a small sin, and I'll do a confession." Kind of laughing at the arrogance of the guy who thinks that he doesn't have any sins. In reality, that arrogance is what he has to atone for. But it was just kind of a joke that we had, which reminded me of that. Okay, so that was one reading of the Gemara. This reading of the Gemara is that the primary confession is the evening service. But because we're worried about your meal getting carried away, you do it at Mincha before, which ends up being, at this point, we're doing confession at Mincha before the meal, just in case you drink at the meal. You're doing it at evening service, Ma'ariv, because that's the main confession. And then again, Shachris the next day, Musaf the next day, Mincha the next day, and Elah the next day, because the entire 24 hours is a day of atonement, totaling 6 confessions, and then 3 at the repetition. That's one reading of the Gemara. That's not the way we read the Gemara yesterday. Now it says the Alter Rebbe and Beis, V'yeshem, and others say, and this is the way we read the Gemara yesterday. This is the reading of the Ramban, as he puts in the footnote, This is how we read the Gemara yesterday, which is like this. There are those who say that the primary time for confession, minadin by law, is not at the evening service as we suggested in section 1. But rather, haschalas man kapara is before the confession begins, before the atonement begins, not the beginning of atonement. The beginning of atonement would be the evening service. But actually, says the Alter Rebbe, according to this view, the primary time for confession is not at the beginning of atonement, but before atonement. That is to say, as it becomes dark. So that he should enter the day having already done teshuvah. Not do your teshuvah at the beginning of the day, but enter the day having done teshuvah already. Like we suggested yesterday, Erev Yom Kippur is about getting rid of the past. Yom Kippur is about moving forward. And therefore, come to Yom Kippur having already done teshuvah. And there should not be any time between your confession to the beginning of the time of the atonement, which would mean you should say the confession just as the sun is setting, so that by the time you're done confession, there's no time and you're straight into the kapara, no time for you to sin. What kind of sin would you be doing just on a legal level? What kind of sin would you be doing sitting in shul for 2 minutes? A thought that isn't Torah. I thought that isn't clean. Yeah, technically speaking, but so in other words, he didn't say be careful for those 3 minutes not to sin. In other words, because a thought comes into one's mind and he doesn't properly get rid of it or replace it with Torah thought, and he indulges for 2 minutes. So therefore, he should go straight from confession directly into Yom Kippur. So right the last minute before Yom Kippur starts, as the sun is setting, say the confession then. That's this view. And therefore, now he reads the Gemara how? And therefore our sages are concerned that by your meal you'll get distracted, drink, and you won't be able to do your atonement as the sun is setting. And therefore you should confess at mincha. Now this is the same reading of the Gemara, but now not about the primary being during Ma'ariv, but rather the primary being before you call Nidre, as the sun sets. And therefore, even though you confessed at the afternoon prayer before your meal on Erev Yom Kippur, you anyways do confession again as it sets, because that's the primary time. Because that's the primary time according to this view. And therefore, and then perhaps sometime between Mincha, the afternoon of Erev Yom Kippur, and dusk when he's doing his primary confession as the sun sets, perhaps some sin happened. And therefore he has to do confession again as the sun is setting. Even though he confessed as the sun was setting, he again should confess that night. So it's a third time that day, once by Mincha, once again before Kol Nidre as the sun is setting, and then again by Ma'ariv. And then as well, every single prayer of that day, Shachris the next morning, Musaf, Mincha, and Neilah, the Fishy Bavade, Gabim Kum, Atzma Chayvlis Vades, Velasha B'Tshuva Shlema. Because certainly, even on Yom Kippur, one should confess and do Teshuvah. The wording is a bit different. So to make it clearer, the first view was that the primary atonement is to be done, the primary confession and Teshuvah is to be done during atonement, / beginning of atonement. And thus it only should be done at the evening service. And then throughout the day, at every opportunity. But then, one second. But then the other view is that actually Teshuvah is to be done before Yom Kippur. And if Teshuvah is to be done before Yom Kippur, then on Yom Kippur, it's actually secondary. The fact that he's doing confessions throughout the day of Yom Kippur is actually secondary, because it's not the time for it. Now it's time for atonement. Confession was yesterday. But he adds, because certainly on Yom Kippur, there's certainly a point in doing Teshuvah also, so therefore say confess as well. According to this view, on Yom Kippur, confession is secondary. It's actually meant to be Erev Yom Kippur. But because Yom Kippur is a day of atonement, therefore it's appropriate, says the Alter Rebbe in this view, to also do confession then. So two views. Is the primary confession on Yom Kippur, and therefore it starts at evening. That's the primary one at the beginning of Kapara. Or is the primary confession the day before Yom Kippur? And therefore that should be at the last moment, just before Yom Kippur starts, as the sun sets. The rest of the confessions they agree on. The confession before Mincha, at Mincha before your meal, just in case your meal distracts. And the confessions the rest of the day, maybe you sin between prayers. The question therefore becomes, practically speaking, should you confess as the sun is setting on Erev Yom Kippur? That's the practical difference. Says the Alter Rebbe, halacha kasvara rishona. The halacha is like the first view. The primary confession is on Yom Kippur. And if the primary confession would be on the eve of the primary confession would be at the evening service. And then there's no need to do any confession before Kandidre, which would mean a total of 6 confessions: Mincha before the meal, evening service, Shachas, Musaf, Mincha, Ne'ilah the next day, and then 3 more at repetition. But nonetheless, it's appropriate for each person, even though this is not the halacha, to be stringent upon himself, in accord with the second view. And therefore, when he sees that the sun is setting, it's arriving, Yama should get up, and confess. And that's indeed the Chabad custom. As I mentioned yesterday, Chabad custom is to do that just before Kol Nidre, as the sun is setting, just mamish. Yeah, but yeah, look, that's true. So you end up doing it as soon as the latest possible opportunity before Yom Kippur starts, which is just before mamish, just before Kol Nidre.
So everyone's in shows talking.
That's correct. When everybody else is serving Hashem and practicing Avos Yisrael, the practicing love of your fellow Jew. Okay. Now we get into the other halacha the Gemara mentioned yesterday, which is, at what point during prayer does one make the confessional prayer? Which is section 3 in Alter Rebbe. Kishayochem mizvada, when the individual confesses, that is to say in his personal undertone Amidah, whether it is the first one he's doing, which is the afternoon prayer before his meal on Erev Yom Kippur, whether it's through one of the actual 5 prayers of Yom Kippur itself, evening service night before, then morning, Musaf, afternoon, and Nila. He does the confession after his prayer is over, that is to say, after he finished all the blessings of the Amidah, but before he took 3 steps back, which in our Siddur is after the blessing of Simshalim, before Lakai Nitzor. Lakai Nitzor, that last paragraph, that's part of the process, as you were, of taking 3 steps back. And therefore we do it just before that process. But the Chazan himself, Omer says, the confession be Yom Kippurim on Yom Kippur, not by Mincha, but on not by Mincha at the day before Yom Kippur, at Yom Kippur, but during the 5 prayers of Yom Kippur, he says the confession be Yom Kippur B'Sechat Tefillah on Yom Kippur. He does it in his prayer, in the last bracha before Moedim, as we noted yesterday. But during the Mincha, the afternoon prayer of Erev Yom Kippur before his meal the day before, he does not say, the Chazan does not say confession when he repeats the Amidah. It's only during the undertone Amidah that we do that. Because considering the fact that the confession at the afternoon prayer of Erev Yom Kippur is not the primary, according to either view, whether you're of the view that it starts before Yom Kippur, the primary is anyways before Kol Nidre, whether you're of the view that the primary is on Yom Kippur and therefore starts on Ma'ariv, this one is only done because maybe during your meal you're going to get distracted because you drank. And therefore, there's no reason to repeat the confession during the Chazan's repetition. Because the Chazan himself, is not repeating the Amidah Elo for no other reason than only to fulfill the one who doesn't know how to pray. And so his repetition is itself not the primary prayer. The confession itself is not the primary confession. It's only because maybe this guy's going to drink during his meal. And how many people drink on Erev Yom Kippur? Actually, I'll tell you about a story about someone who drank on Erev Yom Kippur. Very beautiful story. So therefore, and therefore, the Chachamim didn't want to impose that the Chazan and the rest of the community sit around and listen while the Chazan repeats the entire confession just because just so that one person who doesn't know how to pray might have a drink at Yom Kippur, because most people are not, it's very few people, at least nowadays, who don't know how to daven from a siddur, especially with English translations. Almost nobody who doesn't know how to daven. Anybody can pray. And therefore, there's no reason to make the chazan and the whole community wait while he does the whole confession, because maybe there's one guy who doesn't know how to read, and maybe that one guy's going to drink at his meal. It's such a slight chance that there's no reason to impose the whole community for that. Okay, so I'm going to stop over here because the next section of halachas gets another set of halacha which we mentioned yesterday. So I just tell you the story. It's a beautiful story. I don't remember who it happened with, but the story goes like this. There was a person who was sitting in jail because the local, what they called in Yiddish, the parrots, which means like the serf, right? This is when landowners were governors in like the old capitalism of Russia, the Tsarist Russia, where governors were landowners. So you owned a bunch of land and you taxed the people who lived on your land and you made them work, and it was, yeah, so it was. So it was not uncommon that these landowners, the governors would pick on the Jews. There's all kinds of, the history of the evolution of communism is very much tied to the way the serfs treated the Jews. No, sorry, the serfs reverse. The serfs are those who work for him. Sorry, the reverse. We were the serfs. They were the landowners. I'm sorry, giving the wrong word. The noblemen, yeah. The governors / landowners. Yeah. I'm sorry. I meant serfdom, but not that they're the serfs. Yes, my apologies. They're not the serfs. We were the serfs. Anyway, so it was not uncommon that a Jew's rent would be hiked because the governor wanted a little more money, and to the point that they would stick the Jew in jail until the rent was paid. And the rent would basically fall on the community. The mitzvah of pidyon shoyim, the mitzvah of redeeming Jews from captivity, raising money to pay the ransom, essentially a ransom, legally rent, but technically ransom, to pay that and let the Jew out. This is a very common occurrence in our history. And there were many tzaddikim, many righteous Jews who spent their lives traveling, finding such sorry Jews, finding wealthy people, convincing them to pay them, to bail them out. This was a common thing. So there's a bunch of Jew who's stuck in such a jail, and another Jew comes to plead his case. Another Jew wants to go plead his case, and he has to get money. I'm maybe mixing some details of the story, but the gist of it is as follows. He ends up going to a tavern and places a bet with the local Russian peasants. It says, if I can drink that bottle, will you give me X amount of money? And they said yes. The Russians want to have a good time, watch a Jew get drunk. So he did. Drank the full bottle, they gave him the money. He still needed more, and he said, if I drank the next bottle, will you give me more money? And eventually he drank his way to getting all the money he needed for the ransom, went to the local landowner, the governor, gave the cash, and freed the Jew. Of course, he's completely hammered, comes to Shul, and passes out on the table. Because it's Yom Kippur that day, but he passed out on the table. And he wakes up, and he sees the Aron Kodesh open, and people are holding Torahs. It's called Nidre. It's called Nidre. People are holding, it's the beginning. People are holding. No, he wakes up and the ark is open and people are holding Torahs, and it's called Nidre. And he's still half drunk, half hungover, half drunk, and he thinks it's Simchas Torah because he's feeling drunk and the Torah's out. So it's Yom Kippur, it's Simchas Torah. He gets up and he grabs one of the Torahs and he starts dancing around the bimah, and everybody's hollering at him, "What are you doing? It's called Nidre, sit down." And I don't know who it was, but the local Rav, who I guess understood or knew the story, said, leave this guy alone. This guy fast forwarded through all of the service with his drinking, all of the service that we're trying to get to. So finally we're going to reach the peak of Simchas Torah after going through Yom Kippur and going to Simchas Torah. This guy is, speed lane straight to Simchas Torah. He's already holding Simchas Torah. You can leave him alone. Let him dance. That's the story of the man who drank on Yom Kippur. I'm missing some details and names, but this is the gist of the story. Have a wonderful day, everybody. God willing, we'll continue these halachas tomorrow.